The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the judge's pen scratching against the paper when I suddenly heard my 7-year-old's voice from the back of the room. "Your Honor, can I show you something my mom doesn't know about?" Every head turned at once. There was my daughter, Lily, still in her elementary school uniform, gripping a cracked old tablet so tightly her knuckles were white. For a second, no one moved. Then my husband shot to his feet and shouted for her to get out, his voice cracking in a way I had never heard in 15 years of marriage. The judge told him to sit down, eyes fixed on that little girl. Lily walked forward, one careful step at a time, and said, as clearly as if she'd rehearsed it, that she had been recording her daddy and his girlfriend for 3 months. That was the moment the air changed in that courtroom, even if no one understood why yet. What sat inside that battered tablet was more than a child's secret. It was a record of a plan that, according to family law experts, has happened in real American courtrooms far more often than most of us realize. A spouse carefully building a false image of the other as unstable, irresponsible, and dangerous, just to win custody and money. My husband had already paraded photographs, bank statements, and a so-called expert psychologist through this very room, all pointing to one conclusion, that I was an unfit mother who should lose my little girl. What Lily was about to show the judge would flip that conclusion on its head, expose 2 adults as liars under oath, and turn me from the accused into the victim of a calculated scheme. Stay with me to the very end of this story, because you will hear exactly what my daughter captured, word for word, and how those recordings didn't just change a judge's mind, they changed the course of our lives. But to understand how a 7-year-old ended up walking into a United States family courtroom alone, holding evidence that prosecutors would later compare to something out of a crime documentary, we have to go back to the night my marriage quietly died, long before any lawyer said the words, "full custody." Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And if you can listen to a mother come this close to losing her child and walk away without subscribing, at least be honest enough to tell us in the comments why, because there are women right now who wish someone had warned them before it was too late. By the time Lily walked into that courtroom, my husband had already convinced everyone I was an unfit mother, including our own daughter, or so he thought. My name is Emily, and for 15 years, I honestly believed I had the kind of life people envy from the outside. I married my college sweetheart, Jason, a sharp, well-spoken guy who went into financial consulting straight out of school. We bought a modest but pretty house in a quiet American suburb where the mailboxes all matched and the kids rode their bikes in circles until the streetlights blinked on. There were PTA meetings in the elementary school library, church potlucks in the fellowship hall, and backyard cookouts where Jason flipped burgers while the neighbors joked that he ought to run for office. When Lily was born, people told us we looked like a postcard. Him in a pressed shirt and tie, me with a diaper bag over one shoulder, our baby bundled in a pink blanket. Whenever I pushed the stroller past the other moms in the park, I remember thinking, whatever happens, at least my daughter has a stable home. What I didn't know was that the stability I depended on would eventually become the very weapon used against me, carefully polished over years until it looked like proof that I couldn't stand on my own 2 feet without him. Jason and I met as freshmen. He loved that I was studying nursing, said he admired people who helped others for a living. Back then, he used to brag to his friends that he was dating the smartest girl in the anatomy lab. We married a few years after graduation, just before I passed my boards. I remember the pride I felt the first time I put on scrubs with my own name badge clipped to the pocket. For a while, I worked evening shifts at a local hospital while Jason built his client list, and even though it was exhausting, I felt like myself, someone who could comfort a scared patient and also pay her share of the mortgage. Things changed right after Lily arrived. One night, when I was bone-tired and still recovering, he sat on the edge of the bed and said I didn't have to juggle everything anymore. He told me he was making enough money now, that it didn't make sense for us to pay for childcare when I could be home with our girl where she belonged. I quit the hospital thinking I was making the most loving choice. At first it felt like a gift, Over time, I realized it was also a quiet transfer of power, one paycheck at a time, from my hands to his. In the beginning, staying home with Lily was busy and joyful enough that I barely noticed the subtle rules forming around me. Jason liked certain things just so, and because I wasn't bringing in a paycheck anymore, I told myself it was only fair to meet those expectations. Dinner needed to be on the table when he walked through the door, but not too early, or it would be cold and not late, or he'd make a comment about, "What exactly did you do all day?" He liked the house spotless in a way that a home with a toddler rarely is, and when toys ended up scattered across the living room, he'd step around them with a tight smile and murmur that other women seemed to manage it. I started timing my entire day around his preferences. Grocery runs early, laundry washed and folded before Lily's nap, floors mopped before anyone could track in dirt. Little by little, I stopped buying myself anything that wasn't absolutely necessary because it didn't feel right to ask. And when he suggested putting all the bills on accounts he handled to keep it simple, I agreed. I told myself this was teamwork, even as my name slowly disappeared from anything that held real financial weight. Years went by like that, and then the tone in the house shifted without any big announcement. Jason's job, which had always been demanding, suddenly became the reason he was rarely home for dinner. He'd call at 5:30 to say a client wanted to meet over steaks, or a colleague needed him late at the office, or some urgent project had popped up that only he could fix. Our Friday family movie nights, once a promise he rarely missed, turned into me and Lily on the couch while his empty place stayed open at the table. His phone, which he used to leave on the counter, became something he kept in his pocket or face down beside his plate. When he thought I wasn't looking, I'd see the corner of his mouth lift at a message, a private little smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. One evening, as I set down plates for just the two of us, Lily, who was 6 at the time, asked in that straightforward way only children have, "Mommy, why doesn't Daddy watch movies with us anymore?" I swallowed the knot in my throat and told her what I had been telling myself, that he worked very hard for us, that grown-ups sometimes had to be busy so kids could be safe. I thought I was shielding her from worry. Looking back, I was helping him maintain a story that everything was fine. It was around then that a new name started to slip into his conversations. Rachel from work. At first, it was small things. A passing mention at dinner about a colleague who specialized in behavioral stuff. A joke that his company kept a therapist on retainer just to deal with stressed parents like their clients. One night, when I walked past his office door, I heard him on a call, his voice lower than usual, saying, "Yeah, Rachel, that's exactly what we talked about last week. The parenting side is the hardest, right?" When I asked later who he'd been talking to, he explained that one of the consultants he worked with, Dr. Rachel Moore, was a child psychologist who sometimes advised on family financial planning, especially when kids were involved. It sounded odd, but he brushed it off, saying she'd been helping him figure out how to support us better and manage stress. After that, he started dropping her name more comfortably, telling Lily that Aunt Rachel knew a lot about kids and might come by sometime to give Daddy some tips. A few times, he mentioned that Rachel might stop over to talk about a work project, and he'd suggest I run to the store or take Lily to the park so they could focus. I didn't argue. I was so used to arranging my schedule around what he needed that it barely registered as strange. I told myself she was just another professional contact in his overworked world. I had no idea that this friendly, invisible presence, this Aunt Rachel, I had never properly met, was already helping my husband sketch out a portrait of me as unstable and unfit, a portrait that would later show up in court as expert testimony. What I couldn't see then was that Jason's distance wasn't random or harmless. It was the first step in a quiet record he was assembling, piece by piece, to convince a judge that I should be erased from my own child's life. The day everything snapped into focus started with something as ordinary as the doorbell. It was late morning, Lily was at school, and I was folding a basket of her t-shirts at the kitchen table when the chime rang. A man in a courier uniform stood on the porch with a small electronic pad and a thick manila envelope. He checked my name, asked for a signature, and left before I could even ask what it was about. I remember how heavy that envelope felt in my hands, far too heavy for a few sheets of paper. I sat down, slid a finger under the seal, and pulled out a stack of documents bound with a metal clip. Across the top, in bold type, were words that didn't seem to belong to my life at all. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Under petitioner was Jason's name. Under respondent was mine. For a long second, I just stared, as if another Emily had been summoned to some stranger's court case and they'd gotten the names mixed up. When I started reading, the language cut deeper than any argument we'd ever had. The petition claimed I had failed in my duties as spouse and mother. It said Jason was seeking full legal and physical custody of Lily, as well as control of all marital assets. It accused me of emotional volatility, mental instability, and consistent financial irresponsibility. I had been out of the workforce for years at his urging, yet here I was, described as if I'd been secretly draining our accounts and neglecting our child. My vision blurred halfway down the page. I reread sentences. Sure, I must have misunderstood. Family law resources I would later consult talk about legal abuse, where one partner weaponizes the court system. But in that moment, those were just cold paragraphs that made me feel like the floor of my own kitchen had tilted. I slid off the chair and ended up on the tile. Papers scattered around me like fallen leaves, holding one page and shaking hands and mouthing the words, "failed as a mother," over and over, as if saying them quietly could somehow make them less real. When the initial shock passed enough for me to flip through the rest, I found the section labeled Exhibits. That was where the picture he'd been assembling really came into focus. There were printed photographs of our house, dishes overflowing in the sink, laundry piled in a basket, Lily's toys covering the living room rug. Each image was dated and annotated as evidence of my chronic neglect of the home environment. I knew exactly when they'd been taken. A few months earlier, I'd been laid out with a fever so high I could barely stand. I remember trembling on the couch, throat raw, while Lily watched cartoons beside me. Jason had stood in the doorway and shook his head at the mess. When I'd asked him if he could handle dinner for a couple of nights, he'd said, "I'm not a housekeeper, Emily. That's your job," and left for another supposed client dinner. Now I saw that at some point, probably while I was too sick to move, he had walked around our home with his phone, quietly taking pictures, not to show concern to a friend, but to keep a record that could be presented to a judge as proof that I couldn't even maintain a basic household. The next stack was worse. Printouts of credit card statements with my name at the top, listing charges that didn't match anything in my memory. A high-end steakhouse downtown, a weekend stay at a hotel near the river, a jewelry store, designer clothing boutiques. In the notes, Jason's attorney had written that these showed a pattern of impulsive and excessive spending on my part. I could hear Jason's voice in my head from years earlier, waving a shiny new card in front of me and insisting I keep it for emergencies since I didn't have an income of my own anymore. He'd told me it was practical, that if the car broke down or Lily got hurt while he was out of town, I shouldn't have to wait for him to send money. What I didn't grasp was how often he'd used that same card himself when we were together, handing it to a waiter with a joke about his business line being tied up, always slipping it back into my wallet afterward. Consumer advocacy sites warn about spouses running up debt in the other's name. But reading about that online and realizing it has your address, your account number, and your supposed signature attached are entirely different experiences. Sitting there with those statements spread out, it hit me that someone had been quietly rearranging the narrative of our life for a long time, and that someone was the man I had trusted with everything. Near the back of the packet, clipped to a formal cover sheet, was a document that made my stomach clench more tightly than any bank record. At the top, it read, "Expert Witness Report. Dr. Rachel A. Moore, Ph.D., licensed child psychologist." This was the same Rachel I had heard about in half sentences and offhand jokes, the one he described as a colleague helping clients handle stress. In her report, she claimed to have observed me with Lily on multiple occasions in public settings over a period of months. She listed supposed dates and locations. A Saturday at our local park, where she said she'd witnessed me screaming at the minor child to the point of visible distress. A trip to the supermarket where she alleged I ignored the child for extended periods while engaging in distracted, erratic behavior. A morning at school drop-off where she wrote that I appeared unkept, disoriented, and emotionally detached. Each ugly phrase ended with the same conclusion, that my behavior posed a risk to the child's emotional well-being, and that in her professional opinion, Lily would be safer in Jason's sole custody. I had never knowingly met this woman in my life. Later, when I started frantically researching similar cases online, I found articles about professionals abusing their credentials in family court, and about fabricated observations being used to sway judges. But that afternoon, it just felt like a stranger had written a character assassination of me and signed it with a license number the court would respect. The thought that a judge, who didn't know me from anyone, might read her words and believe that I was some unstable, neglectful parent made my chest feel too tight to breathe. I was still on the kitchen floor, surrounded by evidence of a person I didn't recognize when Jason came home early. Normally, he texted before walking in at odd hours, but that day the front door opened without warning. I heard his footsteps pause when he saw the spread of papers. He didn't rush over to comfort me or ask what was wrong. He stepped closer, glanced at the petition on top, and a small, satisfied smile tugged at the corner of his mouth before he smoothed it away. I forced myself to stand, gripping the edge of the counter for balance. My voice came out hoarse when I asked him what any wife in my position would ask. What did I do wrong? He didn't hesitate. He didn't even look embarrassed. He shrugged out of his jacket, draped it over a chair as if he'd just come home from a normal day, and started listing my supposed flaws like he was reading from a checklist. He told me I was boring, that I'd become dependent, that I had no life outside the house. He said he'd carried me for years while I played stay-at-home mom, as if raising our daughter and running our home had been some kind of hobby. I mentioned the report by Dr. Moore, my voice cracking over the name, and asked if she was the same Rachel I'd heard him talk about. There was a brief flash in his eyes. Not guilt exactly, more like annoyance at being found out earlier than he'd planned. Then he nodded and said, almost proudly, that yes, Rachel was the psychologist, and that she was, in his words, his future. He called her brilliant, successful, said she understood his world in a way I never had. When I whispered, "You're seeing her," he didn't deny it. He just said that whatever was happening between them was adult business, and that the papers already filed would make this clean for everyone. Somewhere in that cold explanation, he admitted that Rachel's glowing credentials would carry more weight than anything I said about myself, and that her report was tailored to match the kind of mother I had supposedly become. I remember staring at his face, memorizing the calm way he spoke about dismantling our family as if it were a business deal. Then he said something that shook me more than the affair, more than the lies on paper. Almost offhand, he mentioned that their case would be even stronger because Lily would tell the truth about me. When I asked what that meant, he explained that he'd already talked to her, preparing her to say that Mommy got tired a lot, that Mommy cried in the kitchen, that Mommy forgot things and didn't like to go out much. He framed it as coaching her to be honest, but the picture he described was a distorted version of every private moment I'd ever had as a worn-out mother. In that instant, I understood that he wasn't just trying to win in court. He was willing to turn our own child into a witness against me, teaching her a script that made my most human moments sound dangerous. In one conversation, standing in the kitchen where I'd packed his lunches and kissed, scraped knees, and balanced family budgets that no longer had my name on them, he managed to take my marriage, my home, our savings, and then reached for the last thing I thought was untouchable, my relationship with Lily. By the time I stumbled into a strip mall law office days later, clutching those documents like a lifeline, Jason had already drained our accounts and hired a polished professional to call me unfit. But as thorough as he'd been, there was one thing he hadn't planned for at all: a quiet little girl, a cracked tablet, and a 3-month record of conversations he thought no one would ever hear. While I was scrambling to find a lawyer who would even take my case without a retainer, poring over bank statements and court forms until my eyes burned, a very different story was unfolding in the quiet corners of our house. I didn't understand it then, I only pieced it together later from what Lily told me and what investigators eventually confirmed. While I sat at the dining table with legal pads and tissues, Lily watched from doorways and from the top of the stairs. Children's worlds are small, but very observant. She heard the way Jason's voice changed when he talked to Rachel on the phone, softer and more amused than it ever sounded when he spoke to me. She noticed that he changed his shirt before work meetings that happened at 9 o'clock at night, and on the evenings when he sent us out on errands because Aunt Rachel was stopping by. She noticed that he looked more excited than stressed. The turning point for her came on a weeknight that seemed unremarkable from my perspective. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from meeting with a legal aid volunteer that afternoon, while Jason claimed he needed to catch up on emails downstairs. Sometime after midnight, Lily woke up thirsty. She padded out of her room in her socks, carrying her stuffed rabbit, and made her way toward the kitchen, following the faint glow of light along the hallway. Before she got there, she heard laughter coming from the living room, not the sound of someone watching a show, but the kind of low, private laughter you share when you're very close to another person. She told me later how she stopped at the doorway and peeked around the corner, expecting to see me and her dad talking. Instead, she saw Jason on the couch with a woman whose hair fell around her shoulders, her shoes kicked off, her hand resting on his chest. When he leaned in and kissed her, Lily froze. At 7, she didn't fully grasp what infidelity meant, but she understood enough to know Dad was doing something he never did in front of Mom, and that he had told her Aunt Rachel was just helping him with work. In that moment, something in her small, orderly view of our family shifted, even if she didn't have adult words for it. Months earlier, long before court papers and expert reports, I had sat Lily down at the kitchen table to talk about safety. It was one of those conversations parents are told to have now, about boundaries and secrets, prompted by a flyer that had come home in her backpack. I remember telling her that if anyone ever made her feel uncomfortable and said it had to stay just between us, she needed to tell a grown-up she trusted. I said that secrets about surprises like birthday presents were fine, but secrets that made her stomach feel funny were not. Because I knew that sometimes children weren't believed, I added one extra piece of advice I'd picked up from an online parenting article. If she could safely take a picture or record something without getting hurt, proof could help adults understand what really happened. I thought we were talking about strangers in parks or older kids at school. I never imagined she would file that advice away and apply it to her own father. In her child's way, that's exactly what she did. After seeing Jason with Rachel on the couch, Lily didn't run into our bedroom to wake me. She slipped back down the hallway, heart pounding, and sat on her bed with the light off, clutching her stuffed rabbit and trying to figure out what to do. She knew what she'd seen didn't match what she'd been told. And somewhere in that tangle of confusion and loyalty, my offhand comment about proof rose to the surface. If Daddy was doing something bad, and if telling me might make him angry, then having something she could show later suddenly felt important. The next day, while I was on the phone in the kitchen with a paralegal about filing deadlines, Lily went digging through her closet. Buried at the back, under a pile of old coloring books, was a tablet we'd stopped using after she dropped it on the driveway. Its screen was cracked in a jagged pattern, and I'd told her it wasn't safe to play with anymore. She pulled it out, brushed off the dust, and pressed the power button. After a long, tense pause, the screen flickered to life. The touch sensitivity was patchy, but the camera still worked. Without telling me, she found a charger in the junk drawer, waited until I was distracted, and plugged it in behind her bed where no one would notice the cord. Later that week, when Jason mentioned that Rachel might come by to go over some paperwork, Lily felt her chest tighten. While I took his suggestion and ran to the store to clear my head, she stayed behind with him. The moment she heard the front door open and a woman's voice greet her dad, she slipped into the living room ahead of them, set the tablet on a low shelf behind a plant, and tapped the record button. Then she hurried upstairs, heart hammering, not entirely sure if this was allowed, but certain it felt necessary. From then on, that cracked tablet became a silent witness. Every time she heard Jason say Rachel's name, every time a work meeting was scheduled at an odd hour, she found a reason to linger near the living room or kitchen, pretended to be playing, and then excuse herself long enough to tuck the device where it could see and hear. Sometimes she hid it behind the curtains by the back door, sometimes on top of the refrigerator, sometimes halfway down the basement stairs. In her mind, she was just doing what Mom had said, getting proof if someone did something that felt wrong. She didn't know that in many states, recordings like hers would later be argued over by attorneys as evidence. She only knew that grown-ups seemed to listen differently when there was something they could watch. Over the next 3 months, that little tablet accumulated file after file, capturing snippets of adult conversations Lily only half understood. She recorded Jason and Rachel talking on the couch about how judges always believe professionals, and laughing about how Emily will never see it coming. She captured Rachel explaining, in cool, clinical language, how Jason should push my buttons, telling him to criticize my housekeeping and my parenting until I lost my temper, then take photographs to show I was emotionally unstable. She caught them referencing the very photos and bank statements I would later find in the petition, discussing how easy it had been to route transactions through the card with my name on it. In one particularly chilling fragment Lily described later, Rachel told Jason that once the court granted him full custody and control of the assets, they could move to another state, maybe even another country, without worrying about Emily dragging us back. Lily didn't understand what wire transfers were or what it meant to move funds offshore, but she understood the part where they discussed starting fresh, somewhere far away, just the 3 of them. Sitting on the top step, listening to voices drift up from below, she realized they were making plans that didn't include me, and that there was a version of the future where she might be told that I didn't want to see her anymore. That thought scared her more than anything. Despite all of that, she said nothing. Jason had already planted seeds in her mind about me being overwhelmed, about Mommy crying because she couldn't handle things, about how we all had to be careful not to upset me. If she showed me the recordings and he found out? What if he said she was the one making trouble? What if he decided I really was too fragile to keep and took her away even sooner? So she did the only thing she could think of. She kept recording and kept quiet. She hid the tablet under her mattress, then in the back of her dresser drawer, then in a box of old school papers, always terrified that Jason would find it and erase everything. She went to school, did her homework, played at recess, like any other second grader, carrying the weight of those secret videos alone. She told no one, not her teacher, not her friends, not me. She guarded those files like a tiny archivist, waiting for a moment she couldn't yet name. She kept those recordings to herself, letting them pile up day after day, until the afternoon she walked past Jason's office door and heard him tell someone on the phone, in a voice thick with satisfaction, "If all goes well at trial, Emily will never see Lily again." On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse looked exactly the way it does in news footage: stone steps, metal detectors, a flag snapping in the wind, but walking up those steps felt like climbing into a different life. I hadn't really slept in days. My stomach was clenched so tight I could barely sip the coffee. Mr. Chen pressed into my hand outside the entrance. He spoke quietly, reminding me to answer only what I was asked, to stay calm no matter how provoked I felt. Online, I had read advice from women who'd been through high-conflict custody fights about how judges in the United States watch a mother's demeanor as closely as they read the evidence. If you cry, they'll call you unstable. If you don't, they'll say you're cold. That impossible double bind echoed in my head as we walked down the long hallway toward the family courtroom where a stranger would decide if I was safe enough to keep my own child. Inside, the room smelled faintly of old wood and paper. Rows of benches were already filling with people waiting for their own cases, but all I could see was Jason at the petitioner's table, looking like a man who had prepared for this moment down to his cufflinks. His suit was perfectly tailored, his tie a calm navy blue, his hair neatly combed. Behind him sat Rachel, in a crisp gray blazer, her posture impeccable, a leather folder balanced on her knees. She looked nothing like the woman my daughter had described curled up on our couch. She looked like authority. Lily, by design, wasn't in the room. A court-appointed advocate had taken her to a separate area to minimize trauma, explaining that she might be brought in later only if absolutely necessary. Knowing she was somewhere in the building but out of sight made my chest ache. I sat beside Mr. Chen at the respondent's table, feeling small in a borrowed blazer, my hands folded tight in my lap as the bailiff called the court to order and the judge took his seat high above us. When the judge invited opening statements, Jason's attorney, a woman named Patricia Blackwood, rose with the ease of someone who lived in rooms like this. In a calm, practiced voice, she told the court that this was a case about a hard-working father trying to protect his little girl. She described me as an overwhelmed homemaker who had allowed her responsibilities to slip until the home became chaotic, unsafe, and financially precarious. She pointed to the photographs and bank records that would, she promised, show a consistent pattern of neglect and poor judgment. For the safety of the child, she said, primary custody should be granted to the stable, employed parent Jason, and contact with me should be strictly limited. Listening to someone frame my life that way, in sentences that sounded so reasonable on the surface, felt like watching a stranger's obituary. When she finished, Mr. Chen stood. He didn't raise his voice or offer theatrics. He simply said that what the court was about to see was not the story of an unfit mother, but of a carefully arranged presentation by a man who had controlled all the money and assets for years, and an expert who had never truly met me. Evidence can be used to show the truth, he said, or to disguise it. We'll ask the court to look very closely at which is happening here. Then the exhibits came out, one by one, laid like tiles in a mosaic of failure. The photos were first, enlarged and mounted for the judge to see clearly. My kitchen with dishes everywhere, the living room littered with toys, a laundry basket overflowing. Patricia narrated as if she'd been there, describing the images as proof of my chronic inability to provide a stable environment. Mr. Chen asked me to explain, and I told the judge about the fever, the week I could barely stand, the night I had begged Jason for help and he refused. But there was no doctor's note, no dated prescription bottle, nothing but my memory. I was painfully aware that many women reading about cases like mine online had warned that without documentation, explanations could sound like convenient excuses. Next came the credit card statements. Neat columns of charges for restaurants I'd never visited and hotel rooms I'd never seen, all under an account bearing my name. Patricia highlighted them as examples of my impulse spending, suggesting I had no regard for budgeting or the financial needs of our child. When I tried to explain that Jason had urged me to keep that card, that he often used it himself, Patricia objected that I was speculating about his finances, and the judge sustained. All that remained on the record was a series of luxury purchases tied to me and a narrative that painted me as careless. Then Rachel took the stand. I watched her walk to the witness chair with the kind of composure you'd expect from someone used to being deferred to. She stated her full name, her degrees, her license, the journals she'd been published in. Judges are trained to weigh expert testimony heavily, and I could almost feel the authority settle onto her words as she began. She said she had observed me with Lily on multiple occasions over several months, always from a discreet distance so as not to interfere. She described a Saturday at the park where she claimed I screamed at Lily until my daughter cried. I remembered the day Lily darted toward the street after a ball, and I shouted her name in panic, but in Rachel's version, my fear became rage. She said she'd seen me in the supermarket, disheveled and distracted, scrolling on my phone while Lily wandered unattended. In reality, I had been checking the grocery list, Jason texted, and Lily had been holding onto the cart handle, but none of those details made it into her report. She mentioned a morning at school drop-off when I supposedly stared blankly ahead while Lily tried to get my attention. That day, I had been fighting back tears after learning about the drained accounts, trying not to break down in front of my child. Piece by piece, she arranged these moments into a pattern of emotional instability. When Patricia asked for her professional opinion, Rachel answered smoothly that I displayed signs of depression and erratic behavior, and that Lily's long-term well-being would be better served in the sole custody of her father. Mr. Chen did his best to challenge her, asking for specific dates, clarifying how she had identified me, questioning why she had never introduced herself if she had such serious concerns. She always had an answer, a vague one, but not obviously false, and she kept circling back to her credentials, reminding the court that her assessment came from years of clinical experience. From my seat, listening, it felt like watching a verdict assemble in real time. expert, exhibits, conclusion. Eventually, it was my turn. My legs felt numb when I rose and walked to the stand. I swore to tell the truth and tried to steady my breathing as Mr. Chen began with gentle questions. How long I had been married, when I left my nursing job, what a typical day with Lily looked like. I spoke about packing lunches, reading bedtime stories, sitting up at night with fevers and school projects. I tried to keep my voice even, to resist the urge to defend myself in long, emotional bursts that could be twisted. For a brief moment, I saw the judge look up from his notes, and I let myself hope that maybe he was seeing a real person instead of the caricature in the petition. Then Patricia approached for cross-examination, a legal pad in her hand and an air of practiced concern on her face. She started with simple, closed questions. I hadn't worked outside the home in over a decade, correct? I agreed. I had no individual income, no independent retirement account, and no substantial savings in my name? Also true. Each answer felt like a nail, tapping quietly into the frame she was building. From there, she moved to my mental state. She asked if I'd ever felt overwhelmed or cried in front of Lily. I answered honestly. Yes, there had been days when I cried in the kitchen or the bathroom, believing my daughter was too young to really understand. Patricia seized on that, asking whether I considered it healthy for a child to repeatedly see her mother in tears. She produced one of the photos Jason had taken me, red-eyed and blotchy, sitting at the table with my hand over my face, and asked me to confirm it was me. Then she described it, for the record, as an example of what Lily likely witnessed on a regular basis. When I tried to explain that Jason had been taunting me that day, telling me I was worthless, the judge interrupted to remind me to answer the question asked. Patricia then asked if I had ever raised my voice at Lily in public. I attempted to describe the incident at the park when I shouted to stop her from running into the street, but Patricia cut in to suggest that my recollection did not match that of a licensed psychologist who had no personal stake in the outcome of the case. Each time I tried to add context, it sounded, even to my own ears, like an excuse. My throat tightened. My eyes stung. And despite every article I'd read warning women not to cry on the stand, tears began to slip down my face. Standing there, with the judge watching, the court reporter typing, and Jason sitting immaculately at his table, I could feel the room's perception of me calcifying into something I didn't recognize. I knew I was telling the truth about my life, but the more emotional I became, the more I seemed to embody the picture they'd painted. A woman who couldn't control herself, who lived in chaos, who might not be able to give a child the stability the court wanted to see. In that strange, detached way you sometimes get under extreme stress, I realized I was becoming, in the judge's eyes, exactly what their petition had described: unstable, emotional, hard to believe. When Patricia finally said she had no further questions, I walked back to the table on unsteady legs, aware that the judge's pen was already in his hand. He looked down at his notes and began to write. In that instant, I was certain I was watching my future narrow to a life of supervised visits, if I was lucky. Then, just as the silence settled and the scratch of pen on paper filled my ears, the back doors of the courtroom opened, and a small, familiar voice cut through everything, changing the entire case in a single sentence. The sound that cut through the courtroom was small, but it stopped everything. As the judge's pen scratched across the page, the heavy doors at the back opened, and I heard my daughter's voice say, "Your Honor?" It was the same voice that used to call for me in the middle of the night after a bad dream, and now it echoed across polished wood and legal pads. Every head turned. Lily stood just inside the doorway, still wearing her school polo and sneakers, her hair a little mussed like she'd been running. In her hands was the old tablet I'd taken away months earlier, the one with the spiderweb crack across the glass. Jason lurched to his feet so fast his chair scraped, shouting that she wasn't supposed to be there, that someone needed to take her out immediately. The judge's face hardened as he ordered him to sit down. Lily ignored her father completely. She walked toward the bench with small, careful steps, holding the tablet out in front of her like a shield. When the judge asked why she had come, she said, in a steady little voice that shook my heart, "I have proof. My mommy doesn't know I'm here." For a few seconds, no one seemed to know what to do. The judge looked from Lily to the attorneys, then back again, weighing the unusual scene against the rules he lived by. In family courts across the country, judges are trained to be cautious when children are pulled into adult conflicts, and you could see that caution in the way he softened his tone when he spoke to her. He asked if someone had told her to come, if I or anyone else had sent her with a message. Lily shook her head and said she snuck away from the advocate because they weren't listening right. She explained, in the plain language of a 7-year-old, that her dad and his friend had done bad things and said they were going to make me look crazy. Then she held up the tablet a little higher and said that she had videos of them talking about it. Patricia was on her feet almost instantly, objecting that this was improper, that a child couldn't just walk into a proceeding and introduce evidence. The judge held up his hand for silence. After a long pause, during which my heart beat so hard it hurt, he told the bailiff to take the device from Lily and see if it could be connected to the courtroom's monitor. He asked Lily one more time if I knew anything about what she'd brought. When she said no, that she was scared to tell me, but even more scared of what her father was planning, something in his expression shifted. Against Patricia's protests, he announced that, in the interest of understanding the full context of this family's situation, he would review the contents. The room went so quiet that the click of the tablet's cable being plugged in sounded like a drum. When the first video appeared on the screen at the front of the room, I almost couldn't look. The image was tilted, slightly obscured by the leaves of the big plant in our living room. I recognized the pattern on our sofa, the lamp in the corner, the edge of the coffee table where Lily liked to line up her crayons. Jason walked into the frame, followed by Rachel, dressed casually, her hair down instead of pulled back in the professional style she'd worn to court. The two of them sat close together. A moment later, Jason leaned in and kissed her, unhurried, in the middle of the room where our family photos hung on the wall. There was a murmur from the gallery benches. Up until that second, his relationship with Rachel in this courtroom had been cloaked in the respectability of shared work and expert testimony. Here, with one shaky recording, that veneer shattered. They pulled apart, laughing. And then the conversation that followed was what made even the judge's eyebrows lift. Jason's voice, clear as day, joked that once this whole thing was over, the house and the money would be theirs. Rachel asked what would happen if I decided to put up a fight. He answered, with a confidence that made my stomach twist, that I had no income, no savings of my own, and that with her report on top of the financial evidence, the judge would hand him Lily without much trouble. I watched Rachel on the stand area shrink a little in her seat as her own image on the screen chuckled and said, "You really think it'll be that easy?" And Jason replied that it already was. The next file Lily had marked was worse. On the screen, the angle had changed. This time, the tablet seemed to be on a shelf near the kitchen, giving a clear view of the table where Jason and Rachel sat with coffee mugs. They weren't affectionate in this one. They were methodical. Rachel was explaining, in the same tone she would later use to address the court, that in order to make a convincing case to a judge, they needed consistent examples of me seeming unstable. She suggested that Jason criticize my housekeeping, question my parenting in front of Lily, and then document my emotional reactions. "Call her worthless as a mother," she said in the recording. "Tell her she's failing. When she breaks down, take a picture. It will align with the clinical profile." Jason replied that he'd already been gathering images when I was sick, that he'd run charges through the card in my name so the debt would attach to me, and that he'd started telling people I was too overwhelmed to handle basic tasks. Rachel nodded and said that once I cracked under pressure, it would support her written opinion that I was emotionally unfit for primary custody. Listening to them calmly describe the very photographs and statements that had been used against me minutes earlier, I felt a strange mix of nausea and vindication. Everything they had stood up and presented under oath, the messy house, the financial chaos, the image of me as volatile, had been rehearsed around my own kitchen table while my daughter listened from the stairs. You could feel the judge making the same connection. His eyes never left the screen. Even Patricia, so composed before, had gone pale and was scribbling furiously, as if distance on paper could sever her from what we were all hearing. After a third recording began, this one touching on their intent to move out of state with Lily once the case was over. Far enough that Emily can't just show up. The judge abruptly told the bailiff to pause the video. He sat back for a moment, his face dark, then leaned forward and asked Jason and Rachel to stand. His voice, when he spoke, carried a weight that silenced even the people whispering in the back row. He said that in all his years on the bench, handling divorces, custody disputes, and the worst kinds of family fractures, he had rarely seen something as calculated and cruel as what had just been played. He pointed out that Jason had come into his court seeking the full power of the state to remove a child from her mother based on a narrative he now knew was deliberately manufactured. He reminded Rachel that as a licensed psychologist, her duty was to protect children and tell the truth, not to sell her credentials to support a lie. Then he turned to the bailiff and, in words that felt both surreal and deeply right, ordered that both Jason and Rachel be taken into custody immediately on suspicion of fraud upon the court, perjury, and conspiracy, pending formal charges from the district attorney's office. The room erupted into a low roar as the bailiff moved to follow that order, the clink of handcuffs cutting through the noise. Rachel, who had been so composed on the stand, began to cry openly, insisting that Jason had pushed her into it, that she'd never meant for things to go this far. Jason snapped back at her, telling her to be quiet, his earlier polish gone, replaced by the panicked anger of someone losing control. The judge banged his gavel until the room settled, making it clear he would tolerate no more outbursts. As the officers led them down the aisle between the benches, wrists cuffed in front of them, they passed by the spot where Lily now stood with the advocate who had finally found her. Jason slowed for half a second, maybe expecting his daughter to look away in confusion or reach out. Instead, Lily lifted her chin and met his eyes. In a small, steady voice that carried farther than it should have, she said, "You shouldn't have been mean to Mommy." There was no triumph in it, just the plain truth from a child who had seen more than she ever should have had to. Jason's mouth opened, as if to respond, but the officer at his elbow kept him moving, and in another heartbeat he was through the door, out of sight. When the courtroom finally quieted again, the judge turned his attention back to me. The petition that had, an hour earlier, looked like a nearly unassailable case against my character now lay under a completely different light. The murmur from the gallery was no longer pitying or skeptical. It was horrified, sympathetic. I could feel my own hands trembling on the table, the enormity of what Lily had done washing over me. In the span of a few minutes, my 7-year-old had shifted the entire momentum of a legal process that, according to many women who share their stories in online support groups, can feel impossible to change once it's moving against you. Jason and Rachel were no longer the confident architect and expert of a tight narrative. They were potential defendants in a criminal case, being booked while the judge revisited every assumption he'd been led to hold about me. Yet even with them out of the room, one question still hung in the air. What would happen to my daughter and me now that the truth had torn their story apart? With Jason and Rachel in custody, the judge still had one more decision to make. And it was the one that would decide where Lily slept, who tucked her in at night, and what kind of life we had left to build from the wreckage. When the door closed behind Jason and Rachel, the judge took a long breath and looked straight at me. For a moment he said nothing, just shuffled the papers in front of him, as if sorting through everything he'd just seen and heard. Then he announced that the petition Jason had filed the document accusing me of being an unfit mother and demanding full custody and control of our assets was dismissed in its entirety. He stated, for the record, that the evidence introduced by my husband and his so-called expert had been tainted by dishonesty and that I had been the target of a deliberate attempt to mislead the court. He granted me sole legal and physical custody of Lily, explaining that any future contact between her and Jason would be limited to supervised visitation and only after input from child welfare professionals. Once the criminal side of the case moved forward, he ordered that all our shared bank accounts and property be frozen and audited, so that any money taken without my knowledge could be traced and returned. Finally, he awarded the family home to me, calling it a necessary step to give Lily some sense of continuity after so much upheaval. Before he moved on to the next case, he looked over his glasses at me and, in a softer tone, said I should be very proud of my daughter. In his words, she had shown more courage and clarity than many adults he'd seen in that courtroom over the years. 8 months later, Our life looked very different from the one I thought I was building when I hung curtains in that first house. Jason was no longer a polished man in a tailored suit. He was a defendant who had stood in a different courtroom to answer for fraud, perjury, and theft. The recordings Lily had made didn't just save our custody case. They became part of a criminal investigation into how he'd hidden assets and lied under oath. He ended up with a conviction and a prison sentence, with the possibility of supervised contact with Lily only if and when professionals decided it was safe. Rachel lost more than her reputation. The licensing board reviewed her conduct, and she surrendered the credential she had used to attack me. Facing her own legal consequences, she agreed to restrictions that meant she would not be practicing as a psychologist again. Financial investigators followed the trail of transfers and shell accounts, and slowly, piece by piece, the money that had disappeared from our marriage resurfaced. It didn't make up for the years I spent pouring myself into a home I no longer trusted, but it did give us the means to choose a different place to live. I sold the house where my daughter had hidden a tablet behind the plants, and bought a smaller townhouse in a quieter neighborhood. Going back to nursing after so long was intimidating. I had to relearn procedures and technology, and I walked into that hospital on the first day feeling like an imposter. But with each shift, each patient who thanked me, I started to remember the part of myself that existed long before Jason's opinions. Lily and I both entered therapy, and slowly, with help, she began to understand that what happened was not her fault and that telling the truth had been an act of love, not betrayal. Looking back now, speaking especially to the women watching this who are in their 50s or 60s and have spent decades taking care of everyone but themselves, I can see how easy it was for me to mistake self-erasure for devotion. For years, I thought being a good wife meant shrinking so that my husband could feel bigger, letting him make every financial decision, letting his mood set the tone in our home, telling myself that my exhaustion was just the price of stability. That isn't love. That's losing yourself so slowly you hardly notice it happening until someone else writes your story for you in the cold language of legal forms. If someone in your life is making you feel crazy, unreliable, or worthless, hear me clearly. You are not what they say. You do not have to wait for things to get as bad as they did for me before you start keeping records, asking hard questions, or reaching out for help. Document the strange things that don't add up. Screenshot the bank alerts that seem off. Write down what is said when no one else is around. Tell a trusted friend, a counselor, a legal aid clinic, even if it feels like you're overreacting. You are allowed to protect yourself and your children. You are allowed to insist that the picture painted of you matches the person you know yourself to be. If this story touched something in you, if you recognized a piece of your own life between these lines, don't keep that to yourself. There are women sitting alone at kitchen tables right now, wondering if they're imagining the shift in the air, just like I once did. Share this video with a sister, a friend, or a neighbor who might need to hear that she is not alone and that there are ways to fight back when the truth is on her side. And if you want more real stories where the truth finally wins, stay with this channel. Click on the next video you see on your screen and let these stories remind you that even in the hardest seasons, there is a path forward, and there are voices willing to stand with you until you find it.